Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be beginning our series in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. We are doing this as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I'll post a link to that series in this video's description, as well as in the following videos descriptions for this read in Economic Facts and Fallacies. As I've previously mentioned, I'm doing this all by request, and as part of that request, I will be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read. The way I'm going to try to do this is to try to limit myself to about 10 to 20 minutes or so of the actual read, and then the complementary 10 to 20 minutes or so, hopefully 10 minutes or less, honestly, of analysis and review of the read we just did, so you guys can better understand both what the content of the read actually means and how I've interpreted the content of the read. I don't know how I'm going to continue breaking up Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, so you have to bear with me because I'm going to be making those decisions basically on the fly today, because the chapters are 30-something pages long, except for chapter 1 and the final chapter. So today we're going to just read chapter 1 in its entirety. It's going to be a bit of a long read, and before we do, I actually want to start off with the preface because I think there is actually something to be gleaned from the preface. And before we do actually start, I have actually already read this book and I've reviewed it. I'll post a link in this video's description to my review as well. So without further ado, let's dive into Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, starting with the preface. Some things are believed because they are demonstrably true, but many other things are believed because they are consistent with a widely held vision of the world, and this vision is accepted as a substitute for facts. Subjecting beliefs to the test of hard facts is especially important when it comes to economic beliefs because economic realities are inescapable limitations on millions of people's lives, so that policies based on fallacies can be devastating in their impacts. Conversely, seeing through those fallacies can open up many unsuspected opportunities for a better life for millions of people. This book, like others of mine, owes much to my two extraordinary research assistants, Nalu and Elizabeth Costa. They not only found much material that I asked for, they often brought to my attention valuable material that I had not asked for. In addition, Ms. Costa did the copy editing, and Ms. Liu created the computer files from which this book was printed. On to Chapter 1, The Power of Fallacies. He begins this chapter with a quote, like he does with all of his works. "Never underestimate the difficulty of changing false beliefs by facts." That's a quote from Henry Hazlitt. Fallacies are not simply crazy ideas. They're usually both plausible and logical, but with something missing. Their plausibility gains them political support. Only after that political support is strong enough to cause fallacious ideas to become government policies and programs are the missing or ignored factors likely to lead to, quote, unintended consequences, end quote, a phrase often heard in the wake of economic or social policy disasters. Another phrase often heard in the wake of those disasters is, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." This is why it pays to look deeper into things that look good on the surface at the moment. Sometimes what is missing in a fallacy is simply a definition. Undefined words have a special power in politics, particularly when they invoke some principle that engages people's emotions. Fair is one of those undefined words which have attracted political support for policies ranging from fair trade laws to the Fair Labor Standards Act. While the fact that the word is undefined is an intellectual handicap, it is a huge political advantage. People with very different views on a substantive issue can be unified and mobilized behind a word that papers over their differing and sometimes even mutually contradictory ideas. Who, after all, is in favor of unfairness? Similarly with social justice, equality, and other undefined terms that can mean wholly different things to different individuals and groups, all of whom can be mobilized in support of policies that use such appealing words. Fallacies abound in economic policies affecting everything from housing to international trade. Where the unintended consequences of these policies take years to unfold, the effects may not be traced back to their causes by many people. Even when the bad consequences follow closely after a given policy, many people may not connect the dots, and advocates of policies that backfire often attribute these bad consequences to something else. Sometimes they claim that the bad situation would have been even worse if it had not been for the wonderful policies they advocated. There are many reasons why fallacies have staying power, even in the face of hard evidence against them. Elected officials, for example, cannot readily admit that some policy or program that they advocated, perhaps with great fanfare, has turned out badly without risking their whole careers. Similarly for leaders of various causes and movements. Even intellectuals or academics with tenure stand to lose prestige and suffer embarrassment when their notions turn out to be counterproductive. Others who think of themselves as supporters of things that will help the less fortunate would find it painful to confront evidence that they have in fact made the less fortunate worse off than before. In other words, evidence is too dangerous, politically, financially, and psychologically, for some people to allow it to become a threat to their interests or to their own sense of themselves. No one likes to admit being wrong. However, in many kinds of endeavors, the costs of not admitting to being wrong are too high to ignore. These costs force people to face reality, however painful that might be. A student who misunderstands mathematics has little choice but to correct that misunderstanding before the next examination, and someone in business cannot continue losing money indefinitely by persisting in mistaken beliefs about the market or about the way to run a business. In short, there are practical as well as intellectual imperatives to see through fallacies. The difference between sound and fallacious economic policies by a government can affect the standard of living of millions. This is what makes the study of economics important, and the exposure of fallacies more than an intellectual exercise. There are far too many fallacies to list them all. However, we can sketch 4 widespread kinds of economic fallacies here, and investigate more specific fallacies in detail in the chapters that follow. These 4 widespread kinds of fallacies can be called the Zero Sum Fallacy, the Fallacy of Composition, the Chess-Piece Fallacy, and the Open-Ended Fallacy. The Zero Sum Fallacy. Many individual fallacies in economics are found in the larger and usually implicit fallacious assumption that economic transactions are a zero-sum process, in which what is gained by someone is lost by someone else. But voluntary economic transactions, whether between employer and employee, tenant and landlord, or international trade, would not continue to take place unless both parties were better off making these transactions than not making them. Obvious as this may seem, its implications are not always obvious to those who advocate policies to help one party to these transactions. Let us start at square one. Why do economic transactions take place at all, and what determines the terms of those transactions? The potential for mutual benefit is necessary, but not sufficient, unless the transaction terms are in fact mutually acceptable. Each side may of course prefer terms that are especially favorable to themselves, but they will accept other terms rather than lose the benefits of making the transaction altogether. There may be many terms acceptable to one side or the other, but the only way transactions can take place is if these sets of terms acceptable to each side overlap. Suppose that a government policy is imposed in the interest of helping one side, say employees or tenants. Such a policy means that there are now 3 different parties involved in these transactions, and only those particular terms which are simultaneously acceptable to all 3 parties are legally permitted. In other words, these new terms preclude some terms that would otherwise be mutually acceptable to the parties themselves. With fewer terms now available for making transactions, fewer transactions are likely to be made. Since these transactions are mutually beneficial, this usually means that both parties are now worse off in some respect. This general principle has many concrete examples in the real world. Rent control, for example, has been imposed in various cities around the world with the intention of helping tenants. Almost invariably, landlords and builders of housing find the reduced range of terms less acceptable and therefore supply less housing. In Egypt, for example, rent control was imposed in 1960. As an Egyptian woman who lived through that era and wrote about it in 2006 reported, quote, "The end result was that people stopped investing in apartment buildings, and a huge shortage in rentals and housing forced many Egyptians to live in horrible conditions, with several families sharing one small apartment." The effects of the harsh rent control is still felt today in Egypt. Mistakes like that can last for generations. End quote. Egypt was not unique. The imposition of rent control has been followed by housing shortages in New York, Hong Kong, Stockholm, Melbourne, Hanoi, and innumerable other cities around the world. The immediate effect of rents set below where they would be set by supply and demand is that more people seek to rent apartments for themselves now that the apartments are cheaper. But without any more apartments being built, this means that many people cannot find vacant apartments. Moreover, long before existing buildings wear out, auxiliary services like maintenance and repair decline, since a housing shortage means that landlords are no longer under the same competitive pressures to spend money on such things to attract tenants when there are more applicants than apartments during a housing shortage. Such neglect of maintenance and repair makes buildings wear out faster. Meanwhile, the lower rate of return on investments in new apartment buildings because of rent control cause fewer of them to be built. Where rent control laws are especially stringent, no new apartment buildings at all may be built to replace those that are wearing out. Not a single apartment building was built in Melbourne for years after World War II because of rent control laws. In a number of Massachusetts communities, no rental housing was built for a quarter of a century until the state banned local rent control laws, after which building resumed. Such tenants undoubtedly benefit from rent control laws. Some tenants undoubtedly benefit from rent control laws. Those who already have an apartment when such laws are passed and who find the lower levels of repair, maintenance, and other auxiliary services, such as heat and hot water, acceptable as a trade-off in view of the money saved on the rent. As time goes on, however, with some deteriorating buildings eventually being boarded up, the circle of tenants who find the trade-off acceptable tends to decline, and places with especially stringent rent control laws tend to have especially bitter complaints about landlords' neglect and failing to supply adequate heat, hot water, maintenance, and repair. In short, reducing the set of mutually acceptable terms tends to reduce the set of mutually acceptable results, with both tenants and landlords ending up worse off on the whole, though in different ways. Another area where governments impose their own set of acceptable transaction terms are laws regulating the pay, benefits, and working conditions of employees. Improvements in all these areas make the worker better off and cost the employer money. Here again, this tends to lead to fewer transactions. Unemployment rates tend to be chronically higher, and the periods of unemployment chronically longer in countries like France or Germany, where minimum wage laws and government policies requiring employers to provide benefits to their employees are more generous than in the United States. And the rate at which these countries create new jobs tends to be far lower than the rate at which new jobs are created in the American economy. Here again, the overlap between three sets of acceptable terms tends to be less than the overlap between the two sets of terms acceptable to the parties directly involved. As in the case of tenants under rent control, those on the inside looking out benefit at the expense of those on the outside looking in. Those workers who keep their jobs are made better off by the various benefits that employers are required to provide by law, but the higher unemployment rates and longer periods of unemployment deprive others of jobs that they could have had In the absence of laws which have the net effect of discouraging hiring and encouraging the substitution of capital for labor, as well as the outsourcing of jobs to other countries. The trite expression, quote, "there is no free lunch," end quote, has become trite precisely because it has turned out to be true for so long and in so many different contexts. Perhaps the most detrimental consequences of the implicit assumption of zero-sum transactions have been in poor countries that have kept out foreign trade and foreign investments in order to avoid being exploited. Large disparities between the prosperity of the countries from which trade and investment come and the poverty in the countries receiving this trade and investment have led some to conclude that the rich have gotten rich by taking from the poor. Various versions of the zero-sum view, from Lenin's theory of imperialism to dependency theory in Latin America, achieved widespread acceptance in the 20th century and proved to be very resistant to contrary evidence. Eventually, however, the fact that many once poor places like Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore achieved prosperity through freer international trade and investment became so blatant and so widely known that, by the end of the 20th century, the governments of many other countries began abandoning their zero-sum view of economic transactions. China and India have been striking examples of poor countries whose abandonment of severe international trade and investment restrictions led to dramatic increases in their economic growth rates, which in turn led to tens of millions of their citizens rising out of poverty. Another way of looking at this is that the zero-sum fallacy had kept millions of very poor people needlessly mired in poverty for generations before such notions were abandoned. That is an enormously high price to pay for an unsubstantiated assumptions. Fallacies can have huge impacts. The fallacy of composition. What logicians call the fallacy of composition is the belief that what is true of a part is true of the whole. A baseball fan at a ballpark can see the game better by standing up, but if all the fans stand up, they will not all see better. Many economic policies involve the fallacy of composition, as politicians come to the aid of some group, industry, state, or other special interest, representing the benefits to them as if they were net benefits to society, rather than essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul. Many local governments, for example, follow policies designed to attract either new businesses or higher income people, both of which are expected to provide more local tax revenues. Whole neighborhoods have been demolished and redeveloped, with upscale housing and shopping malls as a means of revitalizing the community. Often the federal government subsidizes this operation with no consideration that the businesses and higher income people attracted there will simply be transferred from some other place, while the usually lower income people displaced are also transferred to some other place. Yet governments from the local to the national level have set up innumerable programs to engage in what is usually at best a zero-sum operation, and is often a negative-sum operation, as millions of lives are disrupted across the country and billions of tax dollars are spent demolishing neighborhoods for no net benefit to the country as a whole. Since policies imposed by government are not voluntary transactions like those of the marketplace, zero-sum and negative-sum operations can continue indefinitely. Nevertheless, at any given location, there can be impressive drawings beforehand and impressive photographs afterward to depict the scene before and after redevelopment and celebrate the visible improvement. For many years, photographers liked to take pictures of slums in Washington with the Capitol dome in the background. Eventually, massive slum clearance projects put an end to such embarrassing photos, but the people displaced went to live in other neighborhoods, turning many of these other neighborhoods into slums, even if these new slums were now located at a politically convenient distance from the Capitol building. Government spending is often said to be beneficial to the economy, as the money dispersed is spent and respent, creating jobs, raising incomes, and generating tax revenues in the process. But usually if that same government money had remained in the hands of the taxpayers from whom it came, they too would have spent it, and it would still have been respent creating jobs, raising incomes, and generating tax revenues in the process. This again is usually at best a zero-sum process insofar as the transfer of money is concerned, and a negative-sum process insofar as high tax rates to finance government spending reduce incentives to do all the things necessary to generate economic activity and the prosperity resulting from it. Advocates of policies to preserve open space in order to prevent overcrowding ignore the fact that the size of the total population is unaffected by such policies, which means that the people who are prevented from living in a given area will make some other area more crowded than it would have been otherwise. The Chess-Pieces Fallacy. Back in the 18th century, Adam Smith wrote of the doctrinate theorist who is wise in his own conceit and who seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a giant society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. Such theorists are at least as common today and have at least as much influence in shaping laws and policies. Unlike chess pieces, human beings have their own individual preferences, values, plans, and wills, all of which can conflict with and even thwart the goals of social experiments. Moreover, whatever the merits of particular social experiments, experimentation as such can have huge economic and social costs. Although some social experimenters may believe that if one program or policy does not work, they can simply try another and another after that until they find one that does work, the uncertainties generated by incessant experimentation can cause people to change their behavior in ways that adversely affect the economy. Some economists, including John Maynard Keynes, saw the uncertainties about the future generated by the experimental policies of the New Deal administration in the 1930s as tending to discourage investment that was much needed to get out of the Great Depression. Boris Yeltsin, the first non-communist leader of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, likewise spoke of, quote, "our country, so rich, so talented, and so exhausted by incessant experiments," end quote. Because people are not inanimate objects like chess pieces, the very attempt to use them as part of some grand design can turn out to be not merely unsuccessful, but counterproductive. And the notion that, quote, if at first you don't succeed, try again, end quote, can be a formula for disaster when consumers become reluctant to spend and investors become reluctant to invest when they have no reliable framework of expectations, since they have no way of knowing what will happen next in an atmosphere of unending experimentation. The Open-Ended Fallacy. Many desirable things are advocated without regard to the most fundamental fact of economics, that the resources are inherently limited and have alternative uses. Who could be against health, safety, or open space? But each of these things is open-ended, while resources are not only limited, but have alternative uses which are also valuable. No matter how much is done to promote health, more could be done. No matter how safe things have been made, they could be made more safe. And no matter how much open space there is, there could still be more. Obvious as this may seem, there are advocates, movements, laws, and policies promoting an open-ended commitment to more of each of these things without any indication of a limit, or any principle by which a limit might be set, much less any consideration of alternative uses of the resources that some people want devoted to whatever desirable thing they are promoting. Health is certainly something desirable, and most people are happy to see billions of dollars devoted to cancer research. But would anyone want to devote half the national income to wiping out skin rashes? Crime control is certainly desirable, but would anyone want to devote half the national income to wiping out the last vestige of shoplifting? While no one would advocate these particular trade-offs, what open-ended demands for open space, crime control, better health, or cleaner air and water do advocate leaves out the very concept of trade-offs. This is what makes such demands open-ended, both as regards to the amounts of money required and often also the amounts of restrictions of people's freedom required to enforce these demands. Open-ended demands are a mandate for ever-expanding governmental bureaucracies with ever-ending budgets and powers. Unlimited extrapolations constitute a special variation in the open-ended fallacy. Much bitter opposition to the building of homes, highways, or even water and sewage systems is based on the belief that these will just attract more people, more traffic, and more urbanization, leading to the paving over of fast-vanishing greenery. But not only is there no unlimited supply of people, every person who moves from one place to another reduces the crowding in the place left while increasing crowding in the place that is the destination. As to the paving over of greenery, it takes quite an extrapolation to see that as a national problem in a country where more than 9/10 of the land remains undeveloped. Unlimited extrapolations are not confined to environmental issues. Courts' decisions in antitrust cases have invoked a fear that a particular growing business is an incipient monopoly. In one landmark case before the U.S. Supreme Court, a merger between the Brown Shoe Company and Kinney Shoe Stores was broken up because Brown's acquisition of the Kinney chain, which sold 1% of the shoes in America, would, quote, foreclose, end quote, that market to other shoe manufacturers, beginning the process of creating a monopoly which had to be stopped in its incipiency. By such reasoning, the fact that the temperature has risen 10 degrees since dawn means that we are all going to be burned to a crisp before the end of the month if unlimited extrapolations are believed. Summary and implications. Many beliefs which collapse under scrutiny may nevertheless persist indefinitely when they are not scrutinized, and especially when skilled advocates are able to perpetuate those beliefs by forestalling scrutiny through appeals to emotions or interests. Some popular fallacies of today are centuries old and were refuted centuries ago, even if they are repackaged in up-to-date rhetoric to suit current times. This brief sampling of general fallacies is just an introduction to many more specific fallacies that are examined in more detail and tested against hard evidence in the chapters that follow. All right, that concludes Chapter 1, and we'll begin my evaluation and my thoughts and an analysis, the analysis and review section of this video now. All right, on to the analysis and review part of the video on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, Chapter 1. So I explained in the opening to this video that I would be doing this as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And, I've already read these two books. I never really did a parallel read like this where I'm reading one simultaneously with the other. So I was a little shocked at just how well the first opening chapters and opening reads of these series complement each other and tremendously overlap. So the open to Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies basically makes mention to the same thing that Henry Hazlitt does in Chapter 1 of Economic in One Lesson, as I described in that video, which is that there are economic consequences that go beyond what is facially and obviously and immediately clear. And Hazlitt goes through the broken window fallacy, and then, of course, throughout the rest of the book, he beats it over your head. He beats you to death with broken window fallacy. I don't think that Sowell really needs to do that, but I think he does a better job of basically at least touching up on Adam Smith's fundamental realization, which was the lesson that I explained in the review and analysis section of Economics of Chapter 1. Again, I'll link to that in this video's description. I also went into great detail in my series on interference, which I will link to in this video's description as well. I think Sowell goes into greater detail on the lesson itself, which is part of why I kind of like this book better, because Sowell does a better job of extrapolating things. The lesson that I just gave you that I'm about to give you, I'll give it in as brief a manner as I possibly can, because I went into it in greater detail in the analysis part of our read in Chapter 1 of Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, which I'll link to in this video's description, as I've said before. The lesson is that anytime you have a mutually consensual transaction, both parties axiomatically are made better off by the transaction. The way that you have economic growth and prosperity within a society over time is to maximize mutually consensual transactions. I went into pedantic detail on my series and interference as to why that's the case and how that manifests. So I won't go into any greater detail than that here. So that's the lesson I think that needs to be taken home, really, as an introduction to any lesson in economics. Now, my textbook, which I'll have to probably get in just a second here, the first lesson they're going to teach you is scarcity. We'll get to that in just a minute. There are some, I'm going to address just a few things that Sowell brought up. So when he talks about words that are undefined, like fair or social justice or equality, clearly I can open up my dictionary and find a definition for all of these words. What he's referring to are words whose definitions are either ambiguous, so that there might be a definition, but it's not really perfectly well defined, or words that have multiple meanings, and the most commonly understood meaning is something that is perfectly innocuous. What he's actually referring to is what's called a Mott and Bailey fallacy. So I'll actually link to Wikipedia's article on that, and I don't profess to be a Wikipedia scholar, but they actually do a pretty good job of explaining the fallacy in that article. And the Mott and Bailey is, imagine a medieval town, if you will. The Bailey is where you do all your commerce. It's where everybody exchanges goods. It might even include some fields where you might do some actual manual labor, and everybody gets along. But when the invading armies come in, you retreat to the Mott, which is the fortress within this city. So that's the literalism of the Mott and Bailey. The fallacy comes when you have a word or phrase who has a clearly perfectly innocuous meaning, but the most common interpretation of it is not that. It's a meaning that goes beyond the literalism, say, of a word. And then when somebody points out, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this, the fallacy is to retreat to the Mott and say, oh, no, we're just referring to the literalism. And I'm going to use a phrase that's going to get me in a ton of trouble, and that's the Black Lives Matter. There is the literalism that Black Lives Matter, which we can derive from the notion that all lives matter, right? So you need to have all lives matter first before you can have Black Lives Matter in a logical sense. But when somebody says, no, I don't agree with, I am not a supporter of Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter has, as everyone knows it, is this movement with the website, blacklivesmatter.com. When we see it chalked onto the sidewalks, when people hashtag it, it's capital B, capital L, capital M. So in this case, because you capitalize in these letters, you're clearly referring to, oh God, what's it called? The proper noun rather than the common noun. So the proper noun in this case is the organization and the movement behind it, which is clearly totally different and completely removed from the apolitical, perfectly neutral literalism that nobody ever uses it to mean Black Lives Matter. So when somebody says, no, I'm not in support of Black Lives Matter, the fallacy would be to retreat to the Mott and say, oh, well, you don't think Black Lives Matter? Well, you're just a racist. We could apply the Mott and Bailey fallacy to the modern interpretation after critical race theory has overtaken our politic. And I hate to get too political on this channel. I'm just trying to give an example of what a Mott and Bailey is. And that to me seems to be the one that comes to mind right away. So let's go ahead and get into those four fallacies that Sowell brings up. These are four fallacies that you will see through examined, because they're going to come up throughout the course of the book, but he wants to get them out of the way here because they're really not worth devoting an entire chapter of 30 or so pages. And what I'm going to find is going to be, dozens, if not hundreds of citations in each chapter. So they'll kind of reveal themselves throughout the course of this book. So just keep these in mind as we move forward with this series. The first thing I'm actually going to point out is the fallacy, because I know people are going to bring up the notion that, hey, he's just pointing out fallacies. It doesn't mean the idea is wrong. So the fallacy is something that you got to be very careful with, because it's almost never used properly. It's not something that's supposed to be not being able to see the forest through the trees. It's actually supposed to be if there is a larger argument, And then within that argument, as it gets expanded on, there's an element not relevant to the actual argument being made, not relevant to the broader argument actually being made, which may be fallacious. So, for example, if I have a larger argument, and then in debating that argument, there's some subset of that argument that I have to use an analogy for. And the analogy, maybe it's an analogy that has a fallacy within the analogy, right? So it's not a proper analogy, right? But the point of the analogy is true and still adheres to the main argument being made. I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but the fallacy would be if somebody points out, hey, within that analogy, there's a fallacy that's completely irrelevant to the argument being made and irrelevant to the point even of the analogy. So the whole argument from top down is useless. That's what a fallacy is. And it's extraordinarily rare that it exists. And number one, and number two, if you hear somebody calling out the fallacy, be skeptical, because it's extraordinarily rarely that it's actually used. Fallacy is usually applied when somebody points out a fallacy within an argument or built into the argument itself, which would be like a zero sum fallacy, for example, the notion that the only way to get rich is off the backs of the poor. Well, to point out a fallacy within that argument, which is a zero-sum fallacy, negates the entirety of the argument. It's not a fallacy. The other thing I'll point out with fallacy is it's kind of a BS fallacy. So it's usually, so my way of thinking is any fallacy that is used within an argument specific to the argument that negates the argument. And if we're talking about a fallacy of extrapolating an argument to its logical end, which is what you should be doing with any argument, then that to me is not a fallacy, even if it necessarily fits the definition of a fallacy. So I'm not a fan of the fallacy to begin with, but also you should be super skeptical when somebody points that out, because this whole book is called Facts and Fallacies. He's going to go over fallacies. So to those folks who are going to try to refute any of this with the fallacy, again, be very careful how you go about that. So the zero sum fallacy is the first fallacy that he brings up, and that's just a pure reflection of the grand lesson of Smith's lesson, which is that anytime you have a mutually consensual transaction, both parties to the transaction are mutually benefited axiomatically. It's not just obvious, it's axiomatic, because in a mutually consensual transaction, nobody's going to engage in the exchange unless they think it's better for them. When you go to Yankee Stadium and you buy a hot dog for $12 freaking dollars, yeah, it seems like it's an extortion that's going on there, but you choose to give the vendor your $12, and the hot dog vendor chooses to give you the hot dog. The hot dog vendor wants the $12 more than the hot dog. You, in the moment, at least want the hot dog more than $12. Both parties are benefited by this transaction. So, and it's an axiomatic truth. If you thought that you would rather have the $12 than the hot dog, then you're not going to engage in a transaction. And that's why it's mutually consensual. And I'm actually going to read an excerpt that we just read, which is, again, a really important point that Sowell brings up. And I think it's a very critical point to understanding economics generally, and a huge part of why I consider this book to be the better book in terms of an introduction to economics, now that I've completed both books. Why do economic transactions take place at all? Very important question. And what determines the terms of those transactions? The potential for mutual benefit is necessary but not sufficient unless the transaction's terms are in fact mutually acceptable. That means they both agree to them. Each side may, of course, prefer terms that are especially favorable to themselves, but they will accept other terms rather than lose the benefit of making the transaction altogether. I talked about this at length in my series on interference, where what you are seeking is mutually beneficial transactions. There's two parts to that statement. You were looking for mutual consent, and you were looking for the transactions themselves. So the more transactions you have, and which are mutually consensual, the better off everyone is, especially the greater society as a whole. The other thing that he points out in this sentence is that there may be terms that aren't as beneficial, but they'll accept a compromise in place. So I talked about the exchange of oats for faring in my video on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So I'll just give you a very short version. the farrier could steal the oats instead of exchanging his ferrying services to Farmer Brown for the oats. That would be a more favorable transaction for the farrier. However, everyone is benefited when, as I explained in that video, so you'll have to check into that. Everyone is benefited when he does the mutually consensual exchange instead. He goes into an explanation of the three parties that are involved in a transaction when there's a government interference with the transaction. And I'm going to just give you the very, very short version of this. So when you have two parties to a transaction, Farmer Brown and Farmer Smith, there's a third party that might get involved and say, you know what, that's not enough oats that you're giving Farmer Brown is giving to Farrier Smith. So you have this Venn diagram, right? So here are the terms. Let's do bigger circles. Here are the terms that Farmer Brown will accept. Here are the terms that the farrier will accept, right? The farrier will accept getting the oats for free, stealing the oats from Farmer Brown. Farmer Brown isn't going to accept that. So that's where they overlap. Farmer Brown, the Smith stealing the oats is over here where it's Farmer Brown won't accept. The more you shrink, if you introduce the third party, which is the government, I'll probably have to build a diagram in editing to show this. You reduce the number of transactions that they will accept, which means you're inherently going to reduce those transactions and the degree of consent within them. So, for example, if they say 100 oats for a week's worth of ferrying are the terms that they would most like to agree to, but they might begrudgingly agree to lesser terms. So 150 oats or 50 oats for a week's worth of ferrying. If the government comes in and says, you have to sell those oats for more than 100, you have to exchange your ferrying services for more than 100 oats, 150 might be in that range, but it's less acceptable terms. So the degree of acceptability of terms has been reduced, and the number of terms that could be found acceptable would be reduced, which means that if the Farmer Brown says, listen, dude, I can't give you 150 oats for a week's worth of ferrying, then the transaction ceases, it comes to a halt. So there's other ways that you can have interference and mutually consensual transaction that I just talked about. Stealing, theft. But in this case, the government introduces an element of interference with mutually consensual transactions and hurts everybody in the process. The zero sum fallacy is an extension of all of this, which is that there is a possibility of making the pie larger. So if you have a literal pie, right, and one person has 3/4 of the pie, and then you bring in, and then by having these mutual consensual transactions, maybe there's something that the maker of the pie, whatever, the baker of the pie is able to do that for the same price allows her to have two pies. Well, now let's say that person who has 3/4 of the pie gets 3/4 of that next pie. Let's say they get all of the next pie. Well, they're not getting rich off the back of the person who only has a small portion of the pie. They're getting rich off of their ability to make more pie. So this is all a reflection of the law of demand. I'm going to explain what the law of demand is, though I shouldn't really have to. I know this is supposed to be an introductory lesson on economics here, but what is a law? A law in science is a description of observable realities, which exists in contrast to theory, which is an explanation of observation. So one is descriptive and one is explanatory. So with the laws of thermodynamics, we're just describing what we see in nature. We're not explaining why that's the case. It just is the case no matter what, and you can't do anything about that. The theories of gravity that exist, like the theories expounded by Newton and those expounded by Einstein, they can actually change because they are trying to explain something. They're trying to explain why it is that gravity exists, why it is that we can predict, say, the drop rate of an apple from a tree, why it is that gravitation here on Earth appears, at least by the Newtonian theory of gravity, to cause objects to drop at 9.81 meters per second squared. So again, theories can change over time. Laws cannot. Theories aren't less hard science than laws. They're they're descriptive rather than explanatory. And in the case of a law of demand, it's wholly unavoidable. It's something you can't avoid. Which is that the greater the price of a service or good, the less people will want to purchase that service or good. And this is true of minimum wage. It's true of rent controls. So if we go to our previous Venn diagram, where is that point where suppliers of the good or service are willing to sell that good or service, and consumers of the good or service are willing to purchase that good or service. And if you reduce that Venn diagram, if you reduce that overlap by having a third party involved, then what's invariably going to happen is a shortage of the number of acceptable terms. So in this case, you have your law of supply and demand. I don't know how to do that with my arms. So it's because I can't tell which way is mirrored or not in the camera. But so the downward slope of demand contrasts with the upward slope of supply, as the price that suppliers of a good or service can get at the market increases, the more they're going to want to supply it. Usually those 2 points meet at an equilibrium. So if you artificially adjust that equilibrium point, if you artificially set a price floor of, say in the case of minimum wage, you increase the minimum wage, then you set a price floor of labor, which means that there's going to be an excess number of people who are going to want to work in a certain field, but there's only so many people that suppliers are willing to pay that rate for, which means that you're going to have, in this case, an excess in the supply of labor and a shortage in the demand of it, which means that you're going to invariably have unemployment. So minimum wage axiomatically by the law of demand and the law of supply creates shortages. It creates unemployment. The same thing is true of rent controls. If I have a house and I rent it out and I can't get the price that I'm looking for to rent it out, then I have to sacrifice something somewhere. This is all a reflection too of scarcity. I might have to go into that in another video, but the short version of scarcity is that the desire for human beings to consume is endless. It's limitless. And the more there is of something, the more we will want of something, and the want to consume is never ending. So the short version of scarcity, which is not complete, and I really should pull my textbook off the wall to give you the definition that they provide, which is significantly more complete, is that all things exist at a supply level that is below our consumer's ability to consume it, below the level at which a thing could possibly be wanted, and which means it's completely unavoidable, which means that, if I'm making pizzas, then if I were to set the price of pizzas at 0, then there's no way. Well, it's the price at 0. So scarcity exists in the case of pizza because even if I set my price at 0, then the amount of people who are going to want to eat those pizzas is going to exceed my ability, even at 0 cost, to supply the actual good, because there are limits on pepperonis. There are limits on cheese. There's limits on tomato sauce. There's only so much that can possibly be produced. But the amount of pizza that people are going to want to eat, particularly in like Manhattan, which isn't far from where I live, is basically infinite. So even if I sell it at 0, if I sell it at 0 price, then there's no possible way for me to even make enough pizzas to feed the demand at $0. I think I've spent a lot of time on this already. So we're going to try to blow through the rest of these fallacies. The fallacy of composition. So the baseball example that he gives, there was another excerpt I wanted to read here. Yeah, here again, the overlap between 3 sets of acceptable terms tends to be less than the overlap between the 2 sets of terms acceptable to the parties directly involved. So that's the Venn diagram he's talking about. So the fallacy of composition that he brings up, first thing he brings up is the baseball example. If one person stands, they'll get a better view. But if everybody stands all at once, then nobody's view is improved. This is actually an example of a prisoner's dilemma. You guys can look into that. It's a pretty neat concept, where if the idea is that if one person stands, then what you're going to wind up getting is everybody stands, and it's to everybody's detriment. To do that, we are better off all just simply agreeing to not stand up. So that's just as an aside from the fallacy of composition that I thought was worth bringing up. The very short version of the fallacy of composition, the point that he's bringing up is that governments aren't producers. In the case of a government, you do actually have a zero sum because they aren't producers, because because they operate with a monopoly over violence. Therefore, there's no way for them to engage in what would be considered a mutually consensual transaction, because again, they are not producers. They are just the controllers of those transactions. So in the case of Desert Island, if you have a guy who's off fishing and he decides to take the time to make a fishing pole, and the other guy is just using his bare hands trying to catch fish, and a third person comes in involved and says, let's say the third person who's just using his bare hands to catch fish is really good at building materials. So the fisherman who took the time to build a rod and reel and is really good at fishing exchanges 10 of his fish or whatever, or 3 of his fish for the guy who's good at building to improve the huts. And in the next, and that gets into comparative advantage, which we will probably wind up getting into in another video. But in the case of the government, if the government comes in and says, 3 fish isn't enough, it's only going to be 4 fish, then the government in this case hasn't actually produced any other fish. They've just taken fish from one person and given it to another person. And in this case, of course, if the fisherman doesn't want to do that, then what he's going to do is not give the other guy his fish. Instead, he's going to have this surplus of fish that he couldn't possibly consume, which is going to rot, and he's not going to have the improvements on his hut. So this is the difference between an artificial compositional change versus a natural. So when Thomas Sowell talks about how if you want to have, so when Thomas Sowell talks about how the nice housing that the government is building is just going to force out the people into other sections, that's true because it doesn't affect the actual composition itself. The composition remains the same, it just moves. So in case of invention, if you have some sort of invention in housing that allows builders to build housing much cheaper, then the quality of housing improves. This is reflected actually in today because if you look at home sizes, including apartment sizes today versus 1980, they've more than doubled in size, which explains a lot of the increase in price, although in real terms, that price has actually gone down. The Chess-Piece Fallacy brings up, this is really simple, and it's just that humans aren't robots. So if you treat humans like robots, there's serious blowback to that. And in the case of the USSR, there was the Holodomor. It was also gave rise to the justification for the gulags in the USSR and in China, and the ones that still exist today in China because they're using people like chess pieces in terms of central planning. And this is why he suggests that social experiments when it comes to economics is a moral wrong. The open-ended fallacy is just an extension of the limiting principle. So in any good argument, there is a limiting principle within that argument. Unless you are willing to take that argument to its logical end, which produces an extreme result, if that extreme result is something that anyone would find acceptable within the argument, then you don't need a limiting principle. But most good arguments require a limiting principle. So in the case of the minimum wage, why not make it $15 million an hour? Well, nobody would ever agree with that. Well, why not? Because you'll bankrupt everyone and no one will have a job. Well, obviously, because that's how the law of demand works. The same thing is true with the notion of saving just one life or at all costs. Well, death by starvation is still death. So if you're going to just completely nuke an economy, just to save one person from a spread of a disease, I won't mention the one that's a topic of conversation today. But if you're going to go at all costs, then those costs include down the line people's lives as well. So the open-ended fallacy is basically just an extension of the limiting principle. Some may think that a free market, it means anarchy. So if you take it to its logical end, it is just anarchy. But in the case of a capitalist free market society, you have a limiting principle built into it, which is that the free in the word free market refers to free from interference. Again, it's in I did a whole series on interference. I'll link to that in this video's description. And the justification of the floor of, say, robbery, in the case of an anarchistic society, is limited by the terms of mutually consensual transactions. So when we talk about a free market, we're talking about what is it free from? Interference with mutually consensual transactions, which again can come from government, can also come from other sources, such as hooligans and robbery. So, if somebody wants to steal something, that isn't allowed in a free market society or in a capitalist free market, because you're not free from interference in that case because your consent has been removed from that transaction. Obviously, I don't consent to being shot because it's taking away from my life. I'm a party to that transaction. When it comes to pollution, I am not consenting to you destroying the value of my property with what you've done, to your property. So I am being introduced to that transaction without my own consent. And this is how, by the way, free market societies actually account for things like pollution and such through the protection of private property rights. In the case that he provides with Browning's shoe, why not just break up all the companies? Why not just say that there's a limit on the number of employees you can have or on your market capitalization or whatever, and and just end it right there. You're not allowed to have any more than that. And if you do more than that, you go to jail. Well, we all know that that's wrong. We all know that that can't work because that is just communism overt. And of course, I refer to not the fantasy of, if you're going to suggest that communism hasn't ever been tried, because it is this utopian fantasy of Marx, then, and not a reflection of anything that could possibly ever be reality, fine. But and I'm talking about communism, I'm talking about the communism that communists call themselves in these countries that try to display it. So it's been tried and died. This is, again, what we get from central planning. This is what we get. This is how we get to things like the Holodomor, and the mass starvations on the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers in the 1930s in China. I was the 1950s, I forget which, where the government blew up their own dams to starve out, to basically murder their own citizens, to starve out people because they were worried about resources not going to where the government decided that they didn't want them to go. So that would be the end of the open-ended fallacy. This is getting really long, so I apologize for all of that, folks. Hope you stayed with me. We'll continue with urban facts and fallacies in our next read. I want to get to that. So the next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies is going to be Chapter 2, Urban Facts and Fallacies. It's way too long to do and read, so we'll have to break that up. I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but that's what we'll be doing in the next read. Until then, it's Mike, signing off.